No one expected a crab trap to end a year of silence. Not Officer Dan Hayes, not the exhausted search teams, and certainly not Grant Westfall, the father who hadn't slept a full night since his daughter vanished. But when a pink phone surfaced from the bottom of the Gulf, everything changed. And when K9, Fang, half beast, half miracle, sniffed that phone, it didn't just trigger an alert. It restarted a case that everyone had already buried. It was a humid Wednesday morning off the coast of Goodland, Florida, and Earl Tompkins had no reason to think this crab haul would be any different. The old man had worked these waters for 37 years. Salt had seeped into every pore of his weathered hands, and the Gulf breeze ran in his blood like molasses. The blue crab trap came up heavier than usual. "That's either good money or trouble," Earl muttered, squinting into the glare. Diesel fumes puffed from his engine while he leaned over the side, watching the rusty cage emerge from 40 feet down. Seawater poured from the trap as it broke the surface, crabs clacking and crawling over each other. But something caught his eye, a flicker of pink buried beneath claws and kelp. He reached in past the frenzied crustaceans and pulled it out, a waterlogged iPhone wrapped in seaweed and barnacles, its glittery pink case faded by sun and salt. "Ain't no crab using FaceTime," Earl muttered, setting the device aside. Back at Goodland Marina, he handed the phone over to the sheriff's office, assuming it was another tourist mishap. What he didn't know was that this phone belonged to Kira Westfall, a 23-year-old adventure blogger who had vanished a year earlier while kayaking through the Everglades' most remote waters. When Officer Dan Hayes received the evidence tag, he barely glanced at it, until K9 Fang froze. The 4-year-old German shepherd, with a chest like a tank and eyes that scanned like sonar, didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just locked in, paws planted, tail rigid, nose trembling. Dan's hand tightened around the leash. "What is it, boy?" Fang moved forward and sniffed the phone through the evidence bag, then let out a low, drawn-out whine. The kind he used when something wasn't right. The kind that had led Dan to bodies in car trunks, abandoned barns, and once to a girl locked in a storm drain. But this one was different. It wasn't just an alert. It was grief. The lab pulled GPS data and partial video from the corroded phone. The last footage showed Kira, vibrant and beaming, paddling through a pristine waterway deep in the 10,000 islands. Her voice came through the static like a memory reborn. "Hey, adventure seekers, this one's for you. Locals say this spot is untouched. Let's find out. Timestamp, 4:47 p.m. Location, a narrow mangrove channel 8 miles inland." Fang was in the corner of the room, still staring at the plastic bag with the phone inside. And then, just as the screen froze on Kira's smiling face, he let out a low bark. "Not random. Directed." Dan turned. "You want to find her, don't you?" Fang bakad again. The sheriff's department had spent 12 months searching the Everglades. Helicopters, drones, cadaver dogs. All had come up empty. But no one had ever brought in Fang. Not until now. Dan stood in the dusty equipment shed of the department's K9 unit, looking down at a faded map of the Everglades. Fang paced beside him, nose twitching every time Dan pointed toward the GPS coordinates pulled from Kira's video. "I want to go back out there," Dan said to his supervisor the next morning, the scent's still fresh to Fang. "That phone's been down there a while, but something about it's anchoring him." "You think the dog smells a year-old memory?" the supervisor asked skeptically. Dan looked down at Fang, whose ears were alert and focused. "No," Dan replied. "I think the memory is still alive. Like what you're hearing? If you're moved by real stories of bravery, loyalty, and justice, especially those featuring heroes with 4 legs, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Heroes for Animals, and hit that bell. You won't want to miss what Fang uncovers next." Grant Westfall hadn't spoken to anyone from law enforcement in 6 months. He'd tried the FBI, private investigators, psychics, everyone. So when Detective Patricia Chin called him that Thursday afternoon, he almost didn't pick up. "Mr. Westfall, we recovered what we believe is your daughter's phone." His world stopped. "We also have a K9 indicating there's still something traceable. We'd like your permission to reopen the case with a very special partner." That night, Dan drove with Fang to the marina closest to the GPS marker, the same location Kira's phone had last pinged. The moon was bright, casting silver lines across the black water. Fang stood at the edge of the dock, nose in the wind, tail stiff. And then, without command, he pulled. Leaping from the dock, he landed on a small skiff tied loosely to the side. Dan followed. "Where you going, partner?" he asked. Fang whined, looking at the open bay. Dan knew the route. He'd been there before, when the case was still fresh. But that had been 12 months ago, and everything they'd tried had come up dry. Now, they were trusting a scent that shouldn't exist. They powered the boat toward the mangrove maze. The Everglades at night can swallow sound, time, and light. But it couldn't hide from Fang. Somewhere in the heart of the channel, the dog let out a deep bark and jumped onto the shoreline, paws landing in soft, wet mud. He began to dig, not random scratching, but intentional movement. Dan crouched beside him and reached down into the muck. His fingers touched something hard, a metal zipper. He pulled it up. A canvas bag, half buried in the shoreline. Inside, a ripped life vest. A GoPro camera with a shattered screen. And worst of all, a blood-stained piece of laminated ID, Kira Westfall's kayaking permit. Dan's voice caught in his throat. Fang sat beside him, panting, staring at the bag with the intensity of a soldier who just unearthed a buried mine. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been here. Recently, the crab trap phone had been planted, not lost. And Fang? He was already sniffing the wind again, ready to follow the next lead. The bag Fang dug up shouldn't have been there. Not after 12 months of silence. Not buried in muck beside a half-sunken shoreline in the middle of nowhere. Officer Dan Hayes stared at the contents. Kira's torn life vest, the broken GoPro, the laminated permit, his thoughts racing. The Florida sun was beginning to rise through the mangroves, casting orange streaks across the dark water. Beside him, Fang sat calmly, panting like they'd just wrapped up a morning jog. But this wasn't over. It was only beginning. Dan placed the evidence inside a waterproof container and radioed dispatch. "This is Hayes. K9 Fang recovered possible personal effects belonging to Kira Westfall near the channel off marker 118, requesting backup and a forensics team at location GPS 25.9127, 81.4171. Copy that, Hayes. ETA for backup is 45 minutes. Advise you wait and secure the area." Dan looked down at Fang. "Something tells me waiting won't be enough." Back at the sheriff's office, Detective Patricia Chin laid out all the recovered evidence on the conference room table. Kira's father, Grant Westfall, sat silently at the end of the room. His eyes never left the blood-stained life vest. "This proves she made it further than we thought," Dan said, pointing at the permit. "And if Fang found it, there's a scent trail. It's faint, but it's there." Chin raised an eyebrow. "After a year? You're betting this case on a dog's nose?" Grant finally spoke, his voice cracked but steady. "That dog found her ID in the middle of a swamp no human could reach. I'm willing to bet on anything that still believes she's out there." Dan looked over at Fang, who was resting at the door but alert, always listening. He doesn't believe. He knows. 2 days later, the forensic team confirmed the blood on the vest was Kira's, and the GoPro, while broken, had salvageable footage stored on its SD card. It was grainy, but one clip stood out. The screen flickered to life. Kira's face filled the frame. Wind swept her blonde hair around her face, and mangroves blurred behind her. "Hey, guys, still chasing that local legend about the big tarpon spot. Locals at the bait shop say it's back behind the maze. No tourists, no maps, just raw wilderness. Timestamp, 4:47 p.m. Same as the video recovered from the phone. The camera panned across the water. A distant engine echoed in the background. Low, throaty, and unmistakably diesel. Then barely audible through the static. Whoa, what's that? The screen cut to black. Chin paused the video. Can you isolate that engine sound? Dan nodded. I know someone who can. That someone was Arnie Bledsoe, a retired Coast Guard sonar tech and part-time marine mechanic who ran a workshop behind the Everglades airboat tours. Dan and Fang met him mid-morning, the smell of fuel and fried gator bites in the air. Arnie wore overalls stained with oil and chewed on a cinnamon toothpick. Dan handed him a drive with the GoPro footage. You think you can match this? Arnie squinted at the waveform. I can try. Diesel's signature sounds like a Cat 3208. Not common anymore unless someone's running older rigs, like shrimpers or smuggler rigs. Dan raised an eyebrow. Smugglers? Arnie shrugged. Offshore runners? Sometimes they repurpose old fishing boats. Strip them down, add compartments. No one looks twice at a crabber heading out past the islands. Dan tapped the screen. Could someone use a boat like that to move people? People? Drugs? Guns? Hell, probably moonshine too. If it floats and no one's watching, someone's hauling something illegal on it. By evening, Dan and Fang were back at Chokoloskee Marina, the closest launch point to Kira's last known location. It was quiet, the kind of off-season silence that only Florida locals could appreciate. Retirees mumbled over bait buckets. A pelican perched on a dock piling watched the bay with prehistoric patience. Fang pulled gently on his leash. Dan let him lead. They walked past the rows of boats until Fang stopped in front of one in particular. A large, aging center console with a faded name across the hull. Second Chance. Dan recognized it immediately. Wade Corbin's boat, he muttered. Captain Wade Corbin was a longtime local, respected by some, avoided by others. 23 years running charters through the maze-like backcountry. No serious offenses, but always dancing just outside the lines. Fang sniffed the hull, then growled, low, rumbling, subtle. Dan didn't say anything. He just noted the reaction. Later that night, Dan met Grant at a small seafood joint just off Route 29. They sat outside beneath the buzzing neon light, eating grilled grouper while Fang lay under the table. He recognized Corbin's boat, Dan said quietly. Grant sipped his iced tea. I remember the name. That's the guy who offered to take me out there last year. Said it was too dangerous to enter the exact spot Kira was last seen. Dan nodded. And now your daughter's belongings show up in that same zone. He claimed it was a manatee sanctuary. Said Marine Patrol would fine us if we entered. Dan scoffed. There's no restricted zones registered in that area. I checked with Fish and Wildlife. Grant leaned forward. So he lied. Or someone made him lie. Fang let out a short, sharp bark, startling a couple at the next table. Dan chuckled. Easy, boy. We're not storming anything tonight. But he didn't say it wouldn't happen soon. The next day, Chin called Dan into her office. We got something, she said, holding up a small evidence bag. Anonymous drop at the front desk this morning. Inside was a blood-stained cloth and a note. You're too close. Stay away from the maze. No return address? No prints? Dan studied the handwriting. Blocky, careful, like someone writing through latex gloves. Someone knows we're closing in, Chin said. Dan looked at Fang. Good. That means they're scared. Dan decided to go back out, this time without notifying the sheriff's office. He borrowed a plain fishing skiff from a friend and launched at dawn. Fang by his side, the Gulf still and gray like a held breath. They entered the back country slowly. No markers, no boats, just winding, narrow trails that all looked the same. Dan cut the engine and let Fang lead. The dog stood at the bow like a sentinel, nose in the wind. Then he barked, just once, and pointed his muzzle left. Dan turned the tiller. They drifted toward a narrow cove. The air grew heavier. The water still. The sounds of birds disappeared. Fang whined. Then he barked again and jumped from the boat onto a soft sandbank. Dan followed with his boots sinking into the muck. Fang ran ahead and stopped, standing still, head lowered. Dan approached and saw what the dog had found. A chain, rusted, half-buried, bolted into a concrete post jutting from the mud. At the base of the post were worn impressions in the earth, shackle marks. Dan swallowed hard. They had found a holding site, one that wasn't meant for crabs or bait buckets. This was for people. Fang sat beside the chain, tail low, ears back. Dan took a photo, then reached out and patted the dog's shoulder. "You just gave us a reason to go federal." The chain embedded in the mangrove bank didn't belong there. Officer Dan Hayes knew it. Fang knew it. Anyone with half a conscience would have felt it. The cold grip of something wrong, something human, being hidden in the heart of Florida's wildest wetlands. Dan snapped more photos and logged coordinates. He didn't touch the chain. He didn't need to. Fang had already confirmed what mattered. People had been here, restrained here, and that changed everything. Dan spent the rest of that morning compiling everything he had. Recovered items, Kira's GoPro footage, GPS logs, Fang's alerts, the shackle site. It was time to push this beyond the sheriff's office. By noon, he was sitting across from his old friend Blake Torres, now a DEA agent, in a modest Miami field office. The place smelled like printer toner and stale coffee, and the overhead lights hummed softly. Blake leaned back in his chair, scrolling through Dan's photos. His jaw tightened as he reached the shackle marks. "This isn't a missing persons case anymore," he said. "This is human trafficking. And the fact your K9's getting live alerts, someone's still out there." Dan nodded. "It started with Kira, but it's bigger now." Blake looked up. "I'll get the Bureau involved. Quietly. But we'll need more than photos. We need a name, a boat, a movement pattern." Dan already had one name in mind. Wade Corbin. Back in Collier County, Dan pulled into Chokoloskee Marina under the pretense of a routine patrol. Fang sat upright in the passenger seat, tail gently thumping against the seat, nose twitching in the wind. Dan approached the docks casually, greeting familiar captains and bait shop owners. It was Florida etiquette. Don't rush into business, especially in fishing towns. A handshake and a weather comment went further than any badge. Corbin was at the end of Dock D, hunched over the open engine compartment of the Second Chance, wiping his hands on a rag that looked older than the boat. Dan whistled. "Didn't expect to see you doing your own maintenance." Corbin looked up and grinned. "Retired mechanics make terrible employees. Besides, I trust my hands more than I trust some kid fresh out of tech school." Dan gestured to the boat. "She's still running long hauls? Couple offshore charters a month. Still pays the bills." Corbin patted the fiberglass. "Old girl's tougher than she looks." Dan nodded. "You mind if Fang takes a look around? He's got cabin fever." Corbin raised an eyebrow. "Sniff away." Dan unclipped Fang's leash. The German shepherd sprang aboard the Second Chance like he'd done it 100 times. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just moved, with purpose. First the deck, then the rear storage compartments, then to a section near the stern that looked like it had been modified. Fang sniffed the hatch, then sat staring at Dan. A trained signal. Hit. Dan remained casual. "She ever see much action near marker 118? Corbin wiped sweat from his forehead. "Marker 118? That's back in the maze, right?" Dan nodded. Corbin chuckled. "That place'll turn you around faster than you can say GPS. I avoid it these days. Too many twisted currents and submerged logs." Dan's eyes didn't leave him. "That where you took Grant Westfall last year?" Corbin hesitated for a beat. "I offered, but there were restrictions in place. Manatee breeding zone. Would have lost my license." Dan didn't correct him. He'd already verified the manatee story was a lie. Instead, he leaned on the rail. "You see anything strange out there lately? Anyone operating outside usual hours?" Corbin shrugged. There's always strange in those waters. Charter guys running night runs, kids getting lost, smugglers doing God knows what. Hell, even the crabs disappear when the moon's wrong. Dan chuckled. You ever see a girl with a kayak out that way? Blonde, about 5'6", GoPro on her chest. Corbin's face didn't twitch. No, he said. Can't say I have. Dan nodded again. He reached for Fang's leash. Well, he said, thanks for the chat. Corbin tipped his cap. Anytime, Officer Hayes. Back at the cruiser, Dan closed the door and immediately took out his notebook. Fang hit on the stern hatch. Boat structure has been altered. Corbin nervous but contained. Denied seeing Kira. Lie. He scratched down another line. Access warrant? That night, Dan received a text from Blake. I ran Corbin's registration. Second Chance was dry-docked in 2022 for engine upgrades, but the dock logs don't match the repairs listed. Also, get this? He bought 3 50-gallon fuel tanks around the same time. Dan replied, long hauls, off-grid runs. He's hiding something. Another ping. I'm bringing in Homeland. Low-key. Surveillance first. Do not confront yet. Dan stared at his screen, but it was already too late. The next morning, Dan was at the station when the front desk called him to the lobby. There stood Grant Westfall, pale, haggard, eyes sunken but blazing. I need to talk to you, he said. Dan brought him into the back hallway, away from the front desk and chatter. Grant pulled something from his pocket. A torn cloth, stained with what looked like blood. Dan's breath caught. Where'd you get that? Grant whispered. From the mangroves. Last night. I went back. You shouldn't be out there alone. I wasn't. Fang found her phone. You found the ID. No one else was going to look deeper. So I did. Dan took the cloth and examined the edges. I found a makeshift dock hidden behind an old fish processing plant off Route 41, Grant said. No boats, but tracks, so please. And I saw Corbin there with Hutchkins. Dan's jaw clenched. Hutchkins, a Marine Patrol officer. Respected, friendly, one of their own. You sure? Dan asked. I have pictures, Grant said, pulling out his phone, and a short video from the trees. Dan watched it. Blurry, shaky. But there they were, Corbin and Hutchkins, unloading heavy crates, talking too closely, like men with a secret. Dan looked at Fang. The dog was already pacing at the door. Dan took everything, video, cloth, GPS coordinates, and headed straight to Blake. By noon, federal agents were watching both Corbin's marina slip and the Route 41 plant. No arrests? Not yet. They needed the full picture, but the net was tightening. That evening, Dan and Fang returned to Chokoloskee. Sunset stained the sky orange-red. The docks were quiet. The only sound was the water lapping against the pilings. Fang pulled suddenly, dragging Dan toward a bait shed behind the marina store. Dan followed, and there, behind a pile of nets, sat a small piece of pink plastic. It was the missing corner of Kira's phone case. Dan bagged it instantly. Fang sniffed and barked, one sharp, definitive sound. Dan looked at the dog, and the realization sank in. They were being taunted. Someone wanted them to find this, to know they were close, to send a message, back off, or it gets worse. Dan didn't say a word. He simply looked at Fang. We don't back off? Fang wagged his tail, slow and steady, like he understood. Because maybe he did. The Florida sun was just starting to rise as Officer Dan Hayes guided a skiff into the backwaters of the 10,000 islands. The mangroves pressed in tight on either side, gnarled roots reaching like bony fingers into the water. Fog clung low to the swamp, giving everything a dreamlike glow and a sense of menace. Fang stood steady at the bow, tail still, nose twitching in the humid air. The dog wasn't just working. He was hunting. Dan kept the engine low, trusting Fang's instincts more than any GPS. Every route in this area looked the same, but Fang's head moved side to side, cataloging the scents. Scent of salt, fish, and something much more human. It had been 3 days since Grant Westfall's secret surveillance video confirmed what Dan had feared. Corbin wasn't working alone. Officer Troy Hutchkins, a long-standing Marine Patrol officer, was seen unloading crates with him at a facility no one wanted to talk about. Now, Homeland Security was watching from a distance, building their case. But Dan wasn't watching. He was doing. About an hour into the maze, Fang gave a sharp bark and turned his head toward a narrow inlet choked with cattails and low-hanging branches. Dan squinted. "That where we're going?" Fang barked again and leapt onto a soggy bank. Dan tied off the skiff and followed the dog on foot. Mosquitoes buzzed around his ears. Mud sucked at his boots. The air smelled like rot and decay. Then Fang stopped. He was staring at a patch of disturbed earth next to a tangle of tree roots. The dog sat, his trained signal for a positive alert. Dan crouched and brushed back the soft soil. His fingers hit plastic. He pulled out a cracked, waterproof container, like the kind kayakers use. Inside were 2 energy bars, a rusted pocket knife, and something that made Dan's chest tighten. A half-burned notebook. He turned the pages carefully. Most were illegible, water-damaged beyond recognition. But one page, torn, jagged, still had ink. Day 5. They say if I behave, I can go home. I don't believe them. Someone screamed last night. I think it was a kid. Dan sat back on his heels, blinking at the words. Fang moved closer, pressing his head gently against Dan's shoulder. "She was alive," Dan whispered. "She was writing this." Dan radioed the Homeland contact immediately. Agent Blake Torres answered on the first ring. "We're in the maze. Fang just found a journal, Kira's. She was held here. We're close." Blake's voice was tense. "Do not engage without backup." Dan didn't respond right away, because Fang was already moving again. They followed the dog deeper into the mangroves. The channels narrowed. Several times, Dan had to lift fallen limbs or help Fang climb over waterlogged debris. But the dog was relentless. Then, around a sharp bend, the narrow creek opened into a wider lagoon, a forgotten bay surrounded by high vegetation and jagged rocks. It was hidden from the sky, shielded from any drone surveillance or helicopter. And in the middle of it, barely visible through the reeds, sat a rusting metal shack built on a platform over the water. Fang stopped and let out a growl so low it rumbled through Dan's spine. "Easy," Dan whispered. He crouched low, pulling out his binoculars. Through the glass, he could see a small pier attached to the shack, 2 boats moored, a generator humming faintly, a man standing by the door, tall, bald, armed. Not Corbin. Someone new. Dan slowly backed away and pulled out his encrypted satellite phone. "Blake, we have a structure. Remote bay in the maze. Armed guard. Fang tracked her here. I think they're moving people in and out of this location." Blake replied immediately. "Understood. Sending GPS to tactical team now. ETA, 45 minutes. Dan looked at Fang. "We're staying low until then." But Fang had other plans. He nudged Dan's hip, then circled toward the left side of the lagoon, sticking to the foliage. Quiet. Stealthy. Dan followed. They crept around the edge, circling behind the shack. That's when they saw the second boat. Not a crabber, not a skiff. It was a go-fast boat. Twin engines, covered with a gray tarp. Built for speed. Smuggling. Fang stopped suddenly. His ears went back. He looked at Dan and growled again. Then he pulled, toward the rear of the shack. They reached a cluster of reeds and Fang lowered himself into a crouch. Dan did the same, and that's when he saw it. A cage. Not for animals. For people. Built from metal fencing, anchored in the mud. Chains attached to the corners. Inside, crumpled fabric, empty water bottles, and more of those plastic-wrapped food bars. Dan swallowed hard. He lifted his phone, snapped pictures. The entire time, Fang stayed perfectly still, trained on the scene. This wasn't a fishing hideout. It was a holding pen. Then they heard it. Footsteps on the planks above. Voices. Dan dropped flat. Fang followed, belly to the mud. Two men were speaking on the shack's rear platform. "We move the next group tonight, midnight, Route 41 drop point. What about the girl? She's still sick. Doesn't matter. Corbin said dump her if she slows us down." Dan felt his breath freeze in his chest. They were going to kill her. Blake's voice came through the radio softly. "Tactical is 5 minutes out. Sit tight." Dan's voice was a whisper. "No time. They're talking about dumping her tonight. I'm going in." "Negative, Hayes. I repeat, do not go in alone." Dan clicked off the radio. Then he looked at Fang. "You ready?" Fang didn't move, just gave a low, determined growl. They moved fast. Dan slid down the embankment and approached the shack's rear. He stayed low beneath the boards, listening. When he reached the far side, he peered around the support post. The two men were there, both armed, one lighting a cigarette. Dan motioned. Fang moved like a shadow. He crept toward the corner of the shack and crouched. Dan waited, and then Fang launched. His massive frame hit the smoker first, taking him down in a blur of teeth and snarling fury. Dan moved in, drawing his service weapon on the second man, who turned just in time to see his partner scream. "Don't move," Dan shouted, "Hands up." The second man raised his gun, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the trees. Federal backup had arrived. The gunman dropped. Fong released his bite and backed off, growling. Agents swarmed the shack, shouting commands. Dan rushed through the door. Inside, in a corner near a moldy mattress, sat a girl. Emaciated, dirty, eyes wide with terror, but alive. "Kira?" Dan said, gently. She blinked, then nodded. Outside, Blake approached, rifle still slung over his chest. "We got him. Shack's secure. Boat seized, all of it documented." Dan pointed at the cage. They were keeping them like animals. Blake's voice was tight. "We're bringing the whole network down. Every last piece." Kira was lifted onto a stretcher. She clutched a scrap of fabric in her hand, her burned journal. Before the medics loaded her up, Fang walked over and sat beside her. She looked down at the dog and smiled through tears. "You found me," she whispered. As the helicopter lifted off, Dan stood with Fang at the water's edge, watching the chaos unfold. Dozens of agents, weapons seized, victims rescued, all because a dog refused to stop following a scent. Dan scratched behind Fang's ears. "You're not just a K9, he murmured. "You're family." Fang leaned into the touch, and somewhere overhead, the sun finally broke through the mist. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fried cafeteria food, but to Grant Westfall, it smelled like home. He sat beside his daughter's bed, one hand lightly resting on hers. Kira looked so small under the hospital sheets, her cheeks hollow, arms covered in faded bruises and raw, healing scrapes. But she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell steadily with each inhale. That was enough. For now, Officer Dan Hayes leaned quietly against the doorway, arms crossed. Fang lay beside him on the floor, tail gently sweeping the tile in slow, contented strokes. "She hasn't said much," Grant murmured, not taking his eyes off her. "But when she looked at Fang last night, it was like something came back." Dan nodded. "Sometimes it takes a dog to make a person feel safe again." After the raid on the shack in the mangrove lagoon, the feds had swarmed like hornets. They found evidence of multiple detainees, discarded clothing, DNA samples, even fingerprints matching missing persons cases from 3 states. But that wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. Back at the station, Dan sifted through the evidence logs from the shack. There were photographs of rusted chains, jugs of water with Spanish labels, and a map scrawled on the back of a seafood order slip. On it, hand-drawn arrows, coded symbols, and a label Dan had seen before, R41. He tapped the folder. Route 41 again. Blake Torres, now officially heading the Joint Task Force, nodded grimly. "We think it's their main holding facility, where they prep for transport." "You're telling me this whole time," Dan said. "We were looking offshore, and they were tucked up right against a major highway." Blake sighed. "That's the genius of it. No one expects the worst things to be hiding in plain sight. Dan looked at Fang, who was sniffing around the corner of the evidence room, tail stiff. "We're not done," Dan said, "and he knows it." Later that evening, Grant was watching the sunset from the hospital's rooftop garden when Kira spoke for the first time. "He had a tattoo on his left arm," she said softly. Grant turned to her, startled but careful not to rush her. "What kind of tattoo, sweetheart?" "A compass, black ink. I only saw it once, the night he took my phone." Grant nodded slowly. "Wade Corbin." Kira's eyes filled with tears. "I dropped the phone when he hit me. I thought it was gone, but I found it 3 days later, when they were moving me to the bigger facility. I hid it in my shirt and tossed it through a grate when they weren't looking." Grant clenched his jaw. "That phone! It saved you!" "And Fang?" she whispered. "He never stopped." The next morning, Dan received a text from Blake. "Meet me off Route 41, 0800. Bring Fang." Dan didn't hesitate. Route 41, also known as the Tamiami Trail, ran like a scar across the southern Florida wilderness, connecting the Gulf Coast to Miami. Lined with palms, closed-down gas stations, and gator tour signs, it was the last place anyone expected a trafficking hub. But as Dan and Fang turned onto an overgrown service road, the details became clearer. Ahead stood an old fish processing plant. The building was surrounded by chain-link fencing and lined with cameras that were too new to belong to an abandoned business. Blake stood by an unmarked SUV, vest zipped up, earpiece tucked behind his ear. "This is it," he said. "Facilities wired, reinforced, and active. But we can't move yet. We need hard evidence linking Corbin to this location." Dan looked at Fang. "Can I take him around back?" "Just don't engage," Blake warned. "No heroics." Dan smirked. "Heroics? I'm just following the dog." Fang led Dan behind the building, where mangroves met the cracked concrete. That's when he stopped. His ears shot up. He growled. Dan crouched beside him. "What is it, buddy?" Fang's nose went to a small metal vent near the ground, about the size of a shoebox lid, crusted with rust and wired shut. He sniffed once, twice, then barked. "Hard!" Dan placed his hand against the vent. From inside he heard it. A cough, a whimper. Someone was inside. He turned back and signaled to Blake, who immediately radioed the tactical team. "Confirming live occupants inside. We're going in." The raid came fast. Tactical agents breached the side entrance with battering rams. Dan and Fang followed behind the lead stack, navigating through corridors that reeked of mold, ammonia, and sweat. Inside, they found a series of partitioned rooms, converted coolers now used as cells. There were cots, shackles, personal items, children's backpacks. In the far corner, huddled behind a steel door, were 6 detainees, 4 women and 2 children. They were dehydrated, frightened, but alive. Fang approached one little girl, maybe 5 years old, curled in a ball. He didn't bark, didn't lunge. He lay down beside her, resting his big head on her feet. She looked up and smiled. Outside, the medics and agents moved quickly. People were transported. Evidence was catalogued. Corbin's name kept coming up. In documents, burner phones, even a purchase order signed under a shell company. Blake clapped Dan on the back. "We've got him!" Dan nodded. "And now we take him down." But Corbin wasn't hiding. He was waiting. That night, as Dan pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed. "Blocked number," he answered. "Hayes." A familiar voice. "You shouldn't have gone poking around in the dark, officer." Dan's blood chilled. "Corbin, you think this is over? You think a few dogs and some flashbangs stop me?" Dan walked into his house, lights still off. Fang followed, hackles rising. "I'm going to disappear, just like I made her disappear. And you're going to live with the guilt of knowing you didn't stop it sooner." Click. Dan stood there, phone shaking in his hand. Fang growled, looking toward the window. And then Dan saw it. A red laser dot dancing across his living room wall. "Down!" he shouted, grabbing Fang and diving behind the couch. The window shattered. Gunfire erupted. Shards of glass rained down like ice. Dan rolled, pulled his sidearm, and fired 3 shots toward the flash of movement outside. Silence. Gone. Fang stood, unharmed but on edge. Dan's heart raced. This wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of war. An hour later, crime scene tape sealed off Dan's house. Officers combed his yard. Blake arrived, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 20 minutes. "He just tried to kill you," Blake muttered. Dan shook his head. "No, he tried to send a message." Blake looked at Fang, who hadn't stopped pacing since the gunfire ended. Dan's voice was steady. "He wanted me to back off." "Are you?" Dan looked down at Fang and smiled. "Not a chance." Corbin was running out of time, and he knew it. With every new raid, every rescued victim, every piece of evidence brought into the light, the noose around his operation tightened. The Gulf had protected him for years. A vast, lawless stretch of water where bad things disappeared. But not this time. Not with a dog like Fang on his scent. Not with a father like Grant Westfall demanding justice. And not with Officer Dan Hayes, who was ready to bring the fight to the water. Dan sat in a temporary command post near Goodland Marina, staring at the tactical map spread across the folding table. Coffee went cold beside him as agents buzzed around, loading gear, syncing radios. Across the room, Fang lay quietly, but his ears stayed perked. His eyes tracked every movement. He could feel the tension. Blake Torres, now fully embedded with Homeland Security, stepped in with a phone in his hand. "We have it," he said. Dan stood. "What?" "A confirmed GPS ping from a burner phone linked to Corbin. Guess where?" Dan already knew. Route 41. Blake nodded. "But this time, he's not hiding in a shack. He's moving cargo. Another boat transfer. Same pattern. Go-fast vessel. 2 patrol vehicles spotted near the docks last night. One matched Hutchinson's old unit." "Even after being exposed, he's using the same route?" Dan asked. "Desperation breeds recklessness," Blake replied. Dan grabbed his vest. "Then we don't wait." By sundown, Dan and Fang were boarding a blacked-out patrol vessel alongside 2 DEA agents. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and something electric. Like the storm that had been dancing along the Gulf all afternoon might finally break. They cut engines a mile out and drifted silently. Fang stood at the bow, wind ruffling his fur. Dan stood beside him, scanning the horizon through binoculars. "There," he said, pointing. "Northwest, 2 lights moving fast. That's our target." Blake's voice came over the earpiece. "Engage on your call. Tactical units are in position near the marina. You take the water, we'll take the land if they bolt." Dan gave a nod Fang couldn't see, but somehow understood. "Let's end this," Dan said. The ocean churned beneath them as they closed in. Dan felt it before he saw it. A flicker of doubt. They were about to confront armed smugglers with hostages aboard a high-speed vessel. No room for error. Then Fang looked up at him, eyes steady. No fear, just focus. And Dan remembered. He wasn't doing this alone. They approached from starboard, lights off. The go-fast boat was dead ahead, idling. 3 men on deck, 1 pacing, 1 loading crates, 1 standing near the stern, watching. Corbin. Dan recognized the tattoo on his arm. The compass Kira described. The same man who'd tried to make her disappear. The same man who tried to kill Dan in his own home. Dan raised the loudspeaker mic. "Federal agents, step away from the controls and place your hands in the air. This is your only warning." Corbin didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the throttle. "Go!" Dan shouted. The patrol boat surged forward. Shots rang out, 2 from Corbin's crew. Fang barked, low and vicious, before leaping onto the bow, muscles coiled. Dan moved with him, diving behind cover as bullets whizzed past. His ears rang. Salt spray hit his face. The 2 vessels collided with a jolt. Ropes were thrown. The agents boarded. Fang darted first, snapping toward the first gunman, clamping onto the man's arm before he could fire again. The man screamed and dropped his weapon. Dan took out the second with a clean center mass shot. Corbin bolted for the cabin. Dan followed, heart pounding. The inside of the boat was dim, lit only by a green instrument panel. He heard a struggle, a scream. Then he saw her, Kira, tied to a bench, face bruised but defiant. Corbin had a knife at her throat. "Back up," he hissed, "or I gut her like a fish." Dan froze. "You won't make it, Corbin." "I already did," he snapped. "For years. You think this changes anything?" Then Fang appeared in the doorway, silent, focused. Corbin saw him too late. The dog lunged. In one flash of fur and fangs, Fang bit down on Corbin's wrist, forcing the blade to clatter across the floor. Kira screamed. Corbin howled. Dan rushed in and tackled him. They hit the floor hard. Dan cuffed him with shaking hands, blood trickling from Corbin's temple. "It's over," Dan growled. "You're done." Outside, DEA agents secured the remaining crew. The rescued detainees were moved to the patrol vessel and given blankets. Kira sat on the deck, hugging her knees. Fang walked over and gently laid his head on her lap. She cried, then smiled. 3 days later, news of the takedown broke across every major outlet in Florida. K9 helps break human trafficking ring in Collier County. Missing vlogger rescued after year-long ordeal. Marine Patrol officer among those arrested in smuggling sting. Dan didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the lives saved, the justice served, and the dog who never gave up. Fang received the Medal of Valor in a ceremony held on the courthouse steps. Dan stood proudly beside him as Kira and Grant clapped from the front row. The mayor called Fang a four-legged hero. Kira called him family. After the ceremony, Kira approached Dan. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up." Dan shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank Fang. He's the one who kept chasing the truth." She knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dog's thick neck. "Thank you, buddy. You saved me." Fang wagged his tail and leaned into her, tail thumping softly. That evening, Dan sat in his backyard with Fang curled beside him. The stars were out. The air smelled like orange blossoms and grilled burgers from a neighbor's barbecue. For once, the silence wasn't ominous. It was peaceful. Dan took a sip of beer and scratched behind Fang's ears. "You did good, partner." Fang let out a satisfied grunt and rested his head on Dan's boot. "Thank you for following this powerful story of courage, justice, and loyalty. From the murky waters of the Everglades to the bright lights of justice, this journey was led by a dog who never lost the scent, and a team that refused to give up. Now, we want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in Fang's journey? Do you think more K9 units should be used in cold cases like this? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heroes for Animals, where real heroes have 4 legs and the heart of a lion.